Most people spend 40 years trying to get rich and end up exactly where they started. Not broke, not destroyed, just fine, functional, quietly disappointed. And the strange part is, they did everything right. They worked hard, they saved, they avoided the obviously stupid stuff. They followed the advice. So what went wrong? Nothing went wrong. That's the problem. The system they were playing worked exactly as designed. It just wasn't designed to make them wealthy. It was designed to make them comfortable enough to keep going. Warren Buffett, worth over $100 billion, made the majority of his wealth after the age of 65. Not because he got smarter at 65, because compound growth is exponential, not linear. The last years of a long compounding run produce more wealth than all the previous years combined. If this is the kind of breakdown you want more of, no noise, no hype, just the actual mechanics of how money works, Smart Invest is where we do exactly that. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Today, we are going to look at what building real wealth actually requires. Not the motivational version, not the influencer version with the rented Lamborghini in the thumbnail, the mechanical version, the one with the math underneath it. Because wealth is not a personality trait, it is not a mindset. It is a set of decisions made in a specific order, compounded over time. And most people either skip the order or they never see how the compounding actually works. Let's start with the thing nobody tells you at the beginning. There are two economies running at the same time in every country. They overlap, they share the same currency, but they operate by completely different rules. The first economy is the one most people live in. You trade your time for money. You spend that money on things that lose value. You save what's left, which, after inflation, is quietly worth a little less each year. This economy rewards consistency. It punishes idleness, and it has a ceiling. The second economy is the one most people read about but never enter. In this one, money makes money. Assets generate income while you sleep. Your net worth can grow in a year without you doing anything additional. This economy has almost no ceiling, but it has an extremely high entry cost, not always in dollars, but in knowledge, patience, and sequence. Most wealth-building content treats these two economies as if they are the same place, with slightly different tips. They are not. Getting from the first economy to the second one is the entire game. Everything else is commentary. Here is how that transition actually works, step by step. Step 1 is the part that sounds boring because it is. You build a base. This means your spending is structurally lower than your income. Not occasionally, structurally, by design, every month. The number that matters is not how much you earn, it is how much of what you earn does not immediately leave. Economists call this the savings rate. Behavioral economists call it the most predictive variable in personal financial outcomes. Everyone else calls it boring and skips past it. Here is the uncomfortable math. If you spend 95% of what you earn, you are building your financial life on a 5% margin. One medical bill, one job loss, one bad month, and that margin disappears. You are not building, you are surviving with good optics. Studies consistently show that households earning over $100,000 per year still report living paycheck to paycheck at rates above 30%. Income is not the variable. The gap between income and expenditure is the variable. So what gap do you actually need? The research from financial independence communities, cross-referenced with traditional retirement modeling, suggests that a 20% savings rate gets you to basic long-term stability. At 50%, your timeline to financial independence compresses dramatically. Each additional 10 points you add roughly cuts years off your dependent unemployment timeline. The point is not a specific number. The point is that the base has to exist before anything else matters. You cannot invest money you do not have. You cannot take calculated risks without a foundation. The base is not the exciting part of the story. It is the part that makes the rest of the story possible. Step 2 is where most people make their first critical mistake. They get the base right, they have savings, and then they put those savings somewhere that feels safe but is actually a slow leak. A savings account in most Western countries right now pays somewhere between 3 and 5% interest, depending on the institution and the product. Inflation, over the long run, averages around 2 to 3%. That means, at best, your money in a savings account is barely holding its value. At worst, it is losing purchasing power year on year while giving you the psychological comfort of a growing number. This is called the illusion of accumulation. The number goes up, the real value does not keep pace. This is not an argument against holding cash. Emergency funds are real. Liquidity has value. 3 to 6 months of expenses in cash is not a mistake. It is architecture. But beyond that buffer, cash sitting idle is a decision, and it is a decision with a cost even when it looks like doing nothing. The antidote to this is not complicated, it's just unfamiliar. Step 3 is entering the market, and this is where the gap between what people think investing is and what it actually is tends to be widest. Most people imagine investing as picking stocks, watching tickers, making calls, timing things. It feels like trading, like a skill, like a game you can get good at with enough practice. Here is what the data says about that picture. Over any given 10-year period in modern market history, roughly 80 to 90% of actively managed funds run by professionals with entire research teams, proprietary models, and decades of experience, underperform a simple index that just tracks the whole market. Not most of the time, not in bad years, most of the time, across most time horizons. This is not because fund managers are incompetent. It is because markets are extraordinarily efficient at pricing in information quickly. When millions of highly motivated, well-resourced people are all looking at the same information and trading on it, the edge available to any individual disappears almost instantly. So what does actually work? Broad diversification, low costs, long time horizons, consistent contributions regardless of market mood. In practice, this means something like a low-cost index fund tracking a broad market index. The S&P 500 in the United States, for example, has returned an average of roughly 10% annually over the past century before adjusting for inflation. After inflation, approximately 7%. That number does not feel dramatic until you run it through time. At 7% real returns, money doubles approximately every 10 years. £10,000 today becomes $20,000 in a decade, $40,000 in 2, $80,000 in 3. Not because you did anything clever, because you gave compound interest enough runway. Warren Buffett, worth over $100 billion, made the majority of his wealth after the age of 65. Not because he got smarter at 65, because compound growth is exponential, not linear. The last years of a long compounding run produce more wealth than all the previous years combined. Step 4 is the part that separates people who build wealth from people who just invest, and it is the most underestimated mechanism in the entire system: tax efficiency. It is not interesting, but it might be the highest leverage decision most people never optimize. Every developed country has created tax-advantaged vehicles for retirement and savings. In the UK, that is primarily ISAs and pension accounts. In the US, it is 401ks, IRAs, Roth accounts. In Canada, TFSAs and RRSPs. The names differ. The mechanism is the same. These accounts allow your money to grow either without being taxed on the gains or without being taxed on the contributions, depending on the type. Over decades, the difference between an identical investment held inside versus outside a tax-advantage account can be measured in hundreds of thousands of pounds or dollars. The number varies by jurisdiction and specifics, but the principle is consistent. Tax drag is real. Shelter reduces drag, and most people have access to more shelter than they use. This is not a loophole. It is not aggressive tax planning. It is using the structures that exist specifically for this purpose. The governments that created these vehicles did so to incentivize long-term saving. Not using them is leaving an incentive on the table. Step 5 is where the second economy starts to come into view. This is income diversification. Employment income is fragile by design. one counterparty, one decision, one restructuring away from zero. The shift that defines most serious wealth-building paths is the transition from one income stream to multiple, not because variety is virtuous, but because concentration is risk. Every financial principle you apply to investment, don't put all your eggs in one basket, applies equally to how your income is structured. This does not require quitting your job. For most people, the sequence is simpler than that. Employment income funds investments. Investments eventually generate returns. Those returns get reinvested. Over time, passive income from invested assets begins to represent a meaningful fraction of total income. That fraction grows. Dependency on any single employer slowly shrinks. There are other routes. Rental income from property, revenue from a side business or a digital product, royalties, dividends. The specific vehicle matters less than the logic. Assets that generate income without requiring proportional additional time. This is the definition of passive income that is worth taking seriously, not the kind sold on online courses, the kind that results from capital being deployed intelligently and left alone. Now, here's where we zoom out and where the picture gets slightly more uncomfortable. Everything described so far assumes a few things that are worth naming explicitly. It assumes you have income above subsistence. It assumes the political and economic environment remains reasonably stable. It assumes markets continue their long-term upward trend, which has held across crashes, wars, and depressions, but is not guaranteed by physics. It also assumes time. Real wealth accumulation done the way described here is not a 5-year project. It is a 20 to 40-year arc. And that is where the conversation becomes complicated for a generation that is, by most economic measures, starting with more structural headwinds than the one before it. Housing costs in most major cities have risen faster than wages for 3 decades. Student debt loads are historically high. Entry into asset markets requires capital that many people in their 20s and 30s simply do not have at the moment they most need it, which is early, when compounding has the longest runway. The math still works, the principles still hold, but the starting conditions are harder, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either not paying attention or selling something. This is not pessimism, it is calibration. Because the response to harder conditions is not to give up on the principles, it is to be more deliberate about the sequence. Cut the base building timeline wherever possible. Enter the market earlier with smaller amounts rather than waiting to have larger amounts. Use every tax shelter available. Add income streams earlier. Be less sentimental about consumption and more aggressive about deployment. The system rewards patience, but it also rewards starting. So here's where this leaves you. The steps are real. Build the base, close the gap between income and expenditure, enter the market with broad diversification and low cost, use every tax-efficient structure available, extend your time horizon, gradually diversify your income. These are not opinions. They are the conclusions that decades of empirical data across multiple countries and economic cycles point to with remarkable consistency. And none of it requires genius, none of it requires timing, none of it requires special access or insider information or extraordinary luck. What it requires is starting the sequence, not skipping steps because the early ones feel slow, and not abandoning the system when it inevitably feels like it isn't working fast enough. The market does not care about your anxiety. The tax shelter does not care about your impatience. Compound interest does not care whether you find the process emotionally satisfying. It just runs the math, year after year on whatever you put in. The uncomfortable question, the one this entire conversation circles but never fully answers, is whether the game, played correctly over a long enough timeline, is still accessible to enough people to justify calling it a system rather than a lottery with better odds for some players than others. The evidence is genuinely mixed, and that is probably the most honest thing you will hear today.